My talk is about taxidermy in contemporary art and pretty much aims to bring you up to speed with my research. In this case, very much in relation to surfaces in taxidermy and more generally in the history of art itself. Part of the preoccupation from which this talk emerges has to do with a number of factors that have very much stirred my recent research. One of them is the work of art historian James Elkins, with whom I work at the Art Institute of Chicago. James Elkins, a few years ago, claimed that there is no account of the materiality of physicality of an artwork that contains an argument about the limits of historical or critical attention to materiality, and therefore there is no reason not to press on, taking physicality as seriously as possible, spending as much time with it as possible, and finding as many words for it as possible. So James Elkins' plea to take materiality seriously in history of art as well as in art making has really captured my attention through my studies on taxidermy, where materiality exceeds the parameters of the tradition of art itself. And we're going to explore these parameters a little bit more through this talk. One of the other influences that has recently shaped my work is the new philosophies of object-oriented ontology. Object-oriented ontology is a metaphysical movement that rejects human exceptionalism over non-human objects. To object-oriented ontology, objects exist independently of human perception and embody charges and essences that cannot be fully accessed by human perception itself. One of the things I find fascinating about object-oriented ontology, I think, is that it enables a new philosophy of art to emerge. I think the potentiality of object-oriented ontology comes to life more readily in the gallery space than in any other realm. I'm also sure that many of you know about the criticism that's been geared toward object-oriented ontology, but nonetheless, this doesn't hinder the productivities at stake. Graham Harman, the leader of object-oriented ontology, has claimed that objects continuously withdraw and that a withdrawn object is translated into sensual apprehension via a surface accessed by thought and or action. So it's important to see this emphasis, objects becoming central and at the same time their surface becoming the access point for us, the one essentially important part of the object itself. And simultaneously, my work has been informed to a degree by the theories of new materialism. In Vibrant Matter, Jane Bennett shifts the focus from human phenomenology to objects and the agency that always emerges from them. Recognizing a new distribution of agency that surpasses the limits of anthropocentrism, the author argues, may encourage the development of more responsible ecological politics. And perhaps before new materialism and object-oriented ontology came to influence my work, Ron Broglio's ideas on surfaces made a mark on my research. Ron Broglio has claimed that contemporary art is a particular investment with surfaces that is useful in unhinging philosophical concepts and moving them in new directions. Most especially with regards to the presence of animals in contemporary art. Ron Broglio has also articulated a very interesting analogy between surfaces in works of art and animals as metaphorically only being constituted of surfaces. So living on the surface, Broglio argues, is a totalization, a form of totalization imposed on animals. In opposition to the cultural depth of man, according to the humanist conception, animals do not engage in critical reflection and therefore lack the depth required by self-reflexivity. They live on the surface. And this is a very important point. It means that our access of animals is always a matter of surface. It happens on their hides, on their feathers, on the fur, on the scales, but metaphorically as well as metaphysically. So I guess the point of this talk really is to think about my work in relation to taxidermy and contemporary art within a broader spectrum than the traditional animal studies inquiry, which has shaped the past 15 years of the art historical turn that has taken more seriously the presence of animals in the gallery space, something Steve Baker initiated with the postmodern animal in 2000. So, moving beyond, strictly speaking, animal studies perspectives can actually enable us to understand what similarities, ruptures, and parallelism may be present between the new wave of taxidermy in contemporary art and other histories of surfaces in art itself. It is for this purpose that I wanted to take us back in time to think about surfaces in art in a more careful way. So this is perhaps my contribution to James Elkins' claim that we owe more attention to materiality. My argument is that perhaps starting from surfaces is a very good place to start. And I think perhaps starting from classical art is also a very good place to start. We all know that surfaces played a very important role in classical sculpture. The polished quality of the stone was particularly important to the Greeks, and most importantly, I guess that we could claim that with the Roman appropriation of Greek sculpture, the surface becomes political. We all know how important realism becomes at this time, and how the polychromy of sculptures in Greek and Roman culture plays a pivotal role in the political structure and the operation of power throughout the empire. It all happens at surface level. And of course, the sensuality of the classical surface is what makes sculpture particularly problematic during the Baroque period and the neoclassical period. Again, it's the quality of surfaces that suggests the amount of labor that has gone into a work of art. So transcending from the subject itself, the surface suggests a very clear idea of power, labor, and knowledge that accumulates into the value of the work of art itself. And surfaces have also played an extremely important role in the history of classical painting. The talent of an artist was partly measured on his ability to render a smooth, flat surface upon its canvas. So whenever we stare at a classical painting, for the optical illusion of realism to function once again, it is extremely important that the surface of the painting disappears. In that way, paint, a liquid material that is applied to the surface of the canvas, can transform into different materials, into skin, into fabrics, into water, or into the sky. It is this flatness, this smoothness of the surface that enables classical painting to play its spell upon us. More recently, photographer Jorma Puranen worked with classical painting and photographed the surface by placing light sources at certain angles in order to magnify and accentuate the minutiae of little ripples that still appear on the surface of classical painting. In so doing, the artist used photography, the medium that is quintessentially associated with the flatness of surfaces, for the purpose of revealing painting's reliance on the surface itself. And then, of course, we encounter the dramatic changes that take place during the 19th century, changes that are usually understood in art historical terms as being based on a radical change of subject matter or iconography, but that can also be understood from the perspective of surfaces. So, for instance, Turner was one of the most controversial artists when it came to the treatment of the surface of his paintings. Think about the sunset seen in the famous painting The Fighting Temeraire. Here we find that just above the sun, paint is applied in such a metallic way. The impasto that Turner uses suggests the texture of the clouds, but at the same time proposes a materiality that was utterly unacceptable to the classical artists and scholars of the time. Thereafter, of course, the Impressionists are equally concerned with the surface of the canvas, and perhaps in a less abrasive way reinvent the surface by making it vibrate, making it express a vitality that classical art was simply incapable of obtaining. It is Monet that later on in his life, when he undertakes the repetitional task of painting water lilies and irises in his garden, pushes paint to an extreme where the brushstroke becomes elongated and its materiality exceeds anything we have seen before. So, during the end of the 19th century and the first 20 years of the 20th century, one of the most significant revolutions in art consumes itself entirely on the surface of paintings. Thereafter, things become more radical, matters become more extreme. Think of Cubism, for instance, Picasso, a literal attack to the surface of the canvas, operated via the application of bits of paper, the invention of collage, then cardboard, parts of wood. And then, of course, Clement Greenberg and his realization that realistic naturalistic art, classical art at that, had dissembled the medium, using art to conceal art. Modernism, he claimed, used art to call attention to art itself. It is in this context that, in a way, we also encounter Marcel Duchamp's fountain. Readymades served a great purpose in the collapsing between representation in a traditional sense and everyday life. The intrusion of everyday life within the artistic canon also caused a short-circuiting of surfaces, where, for instance, when it comes to Duchamp's famous fountain, the only claim this urinal makes to once having been a real object is based on its surface. It is not made of marble, it is not made of bronze, it is made of the ceramic of which all other urinals are made. Upon looking at this piece, once it's displayed in a cabinet, the viewer cannot ascertain its nature beyond looking at the surface and establishing that it's the same as any other urinal they have seen. So ready-mades play with surfaces in a much more sophisticated way, in a much more complex way that perhaps has been acknowledged thus far. And it's within this context that we could problematize matter further by looking at Meret Hoppenheim's very famous object, a cup, saucer, and teaspoon entirely covered in fur. This is, of course, also one of the most meaningful objects that I wouldn't quite class as taxidermy in a more classical or contemporary sense even, but definitely a work of art that plays with a critical awareness of surfaces and their importance in a way that had never been witnessed before. And these works of art, I argue, strongly influence and inform the return of taxidermy that we're witnessing in contemporary art. It is important to remember that I'm, of course, skipping and generalizing here. Well, that's the nature of meta-narratives, and sometimes meta-narratives can be useful, as perhaps I'm proving here. One of the moments that perhaps is more meaningful than others in history of art was presented by the new avant-garde of the second post-war period, and I'm thinking more specifically of Jasper Jones and artists like Rauschenberg. They played with surfaces of their objects in a much more playful but critical way than any other movement or artist before. Jasper Jones's Elkins, for instance, represent an extremely interesting hybrid, a crossover between a real sculpture and a ready-made. Here we have a couple of ale cans that are made of bronze, yet again their surface, which is polished, is painted to resemble the presence of their original label. And perhaps the most important example for this talk and my research more in general is definitely Rauschenberg's monogram. Monogram came on the scene at the end of the 1950s, and it shocked the public for its unorthodox iconographical solution. Yet, one of the things that I find most fascinating about monogram, it's the freedom in which it incorporates a piece of taxidermy, an Angora goat, and different textures and different surfaces. I think that that's where very much beyond the symbolism that might be read within the work itself, its strength really lies. What we see in monogram is the juxtaposition of different surfaces, from the industrial made in the rubber tire, the biosurfaces, organic surfaces of the Angora goat, and then the raft upon which the Angora goat stands, which simultaneously suggests the presence of painting and that of wood. So monogram, I think it's particularly fascinating for these surface dialectics that are set up between these different materials, their histories, and the play of surfaces that it presents. Especially when looking at the goat's face, I think we find this juxtaposition of fur and paint, the medium that once upon a time in classical art was entrusted with the duty of making the fur of a goat look realistic enough for us to believe it. It's now presented as what it is, this wet substance that drips, which is splashed all over the goat's face. And of course, it is at this point that we find, I argue, an interesting bifurcation in the history of surfaces that I'm trying to trace. So the second post-war period becomes interesting for an aesthetic that's perhaps better embodied by artists such as Rauschenberg and Jasper Jones, which involves a level of messiness or tattiness to the surfaces, and like we've seen in Rauschenberg, the inclusion of natural surfaces too. Whilst on the other side, in the 60s, with the emergence of pop art, we have the persistent presence of surfaces that are sleek, polished, and that speak of industrial narratives for that matter. Even when, like in the Brillo box by Andy Warhol, they reverse the game of the ready-made in an unprecedented way. So these two tendencies that developed during the post-war period, I argue, are essential to better understanding what's happening right now in contemporary art. When you look around at contemporary works of art, you can clearly see that we're still very much surrounded by this dichotomy, the polished, sleek, reflective surfaces of some pop artists that still operate today, and the more organic and less man-handled surfaces, which at times lie about their originality and their simplicity. So just to bring up our journey to the contemporary period, I just wanted to spare a word about Jeff Koons, who's also the subject of an exhibition here at Norwich Castle. And of course, Jeff Koons can be considered a master at surfaces. A lot of the value of Jeff Koons' works of art rests on the polished surfaces he creates with the help of his assistants. And for that matter, a lot of the veridicity, the realism, and also the enigmatic quality that these works embody rests entirely on the surface. Like for Duchamp's Readymade, in Rabbit we're not allowed to verify the nature of the material which lies underneath the reflective surface of the object, but we're invited to trust and believe the artist that the object itself might be an inflatable balloon, whilst we get to know by reading the label that it's actually made of stainless steel. It is this playfulness and ambiguity that makes the artwork so ambiguous and so interesting. It is at this point that perhaps considering the influence that Surrealism bears on both kinds of objects might also be important. So the work of art historian Joanna Malt has also become influential to mine. In Obscure Objects of Desire, Surrealism, Fetishism, and Politics, Joanna Malt argues that acknowledging and simultaneously moving beyond the foundations laid by the Duchampian ready-made enables the configuration of a surrealist object as that which inserts a discourse on the body, and the human body that is, amongst those already dislocated by the commoditized mass-produced objects of everyday life which already have infiltrated artistic discourses. Both perhaps Rabbit by Jeff Koons and Monogram by Rauschenberg show some undertones of surrealism, but one of the things that I believe is particularly important here is this idea of the insertion of the body, which was first operated by surrealism and by the work of Meret Oppenheim and other surrealist artists during the 30s, 1920s and 1930s. If you like, in a sense, Jeff Koons' Rabbit, it's much closer to the operations of Andy Warhol and the Readymades by Duchamp. Whilst some of the taxidermy I will explore in a minute with you bears a more direct link to the tradition of Surrealism, not just because of the idea of recuperating the uncanny and the strange, like some might easily assume, but actually because of this idea of inserting the body, an insertion of the body that played entirely upon the claim made by surfaces and perhaps by the lure of the surface, which in fact, in the case of taxidermy, is a veneer. It is in the context of these influences that I've started to think about taxidermy in contemporary art beyond the remit of animal studies. For those of you who are familiar with the agendas and politics of animal studies and contemporary art, you are aware that an animal studies oriented critique would pass an ethical judgment upon the use of taxidermy and also read most readily the idea of taxidermy as the only way in which we can understand animals. As Steve Baker coined in 2000 with the postmodern animal, the concept of botched taxidermy is one which applies to representational values of animals more in general. It is impossible to access animals for what they really may be, and therefore all we see is always somewhat of a form of taxidermy. However, focusing on surfaces leads us back to an interesting trail, the Surrealist trail that I outlined for you just a minute ago. And the work of Berlinde de Bruckier, amongst other artists, I think is particularly interesting in this context. So the artist, for instance, sources her horses ethically. These are horses that are dead for different reasons. They've died in accidents or of age. And the skin is then taxidermied in a very unconventional way that sways entirely from the tradition of taxidermy itself. So as you can see, the body of horses are barely recognizable in Berlinde Bruckier's work. And this is particularly important. I have argued before elsewhere that it is in this deforming of the body, in this lack of realism, that the surface actually acquires an incredible importance. Remember when I said earlier that in classical art, the surface plays a key role in the sensuality that ultimately captivates us? Well, in Berlinde de Bruckier's work, the surface still retains a level of sensuality that it's disjointed from realism itself. It's the insertion of the body that I was talking to you just earlier on, and this idea that the body is inserted in taxidermy on a different ontological level from that of classical art. Classical art has always relied on a very important concept of transubstantiation. So for an object to be called art, this object needs to represent another object, but it needs to represent it very accurately through a different material. It's this form of transition from one object to another that is operated by the artist that, supported by realism, makes the work of art what it really is. With Berlinde Bruckier, what we see is that this joining of the link between realism and the sensuality of surfaces, in which sensuality is turned upon its head to suggest a sense of anguish and unease, in opposition to the classical idea of fulfillment, joy, and plenitude. So when it comes to the surfaces of Berlinde Bruckier's horses, they can be read as a tangible and undeniable insertion of the body, a body that the artist understands as a receptacle of pain. The artist became first interested in horses and taxidermy upon seeing some photographs of horses that died at war. She was struck by the utter vulnerability that was represented by this lifeless horses lying on the ground and seemingly appearing deformed. So in a way she incorporates and subverts the classical representational iconography of the equestrian portrait and upturns it in order to display a level of pain that can only be physically felt on the body of the animal itself. Another artwork that I've been very much interested by, in which I think a very interesting play of surfaces is consumed in a very productive way, is It's Hard to Make a Stand by artist Steve Bishop. This piece, I think, sits uncomfortably between the Duchampian ready-made and the surrealist art object in a number of ways. The play of surfaces that It's Hard to Make a Stand proposes is very much linked to that we have witnessed in Monogram by Rauschenberg. You can see that here too we have the fur just opposed to mass-produced industrial materials such as the cellophane that wraps the body of the horse, or the mannequin, which is made of polyurethane, which is a very available material right now that's used for very different purposes and that has actually infiltrated the art world quite consistently. Now, the piece itself in this case once again speaks of animal vulnerability. The fur represents the totalization of animals. From a certain angle, we seem to be in the presence of a dog's head which covers the head of the horse itself. So at once, we're not just standing in front of a horse, but we're standing in front of a dog, a horse, and a number of unnamed animals that have been turned into the fur that we see folded over the structure. So the piece itself speaks of commoditization, whether the animal may be alive or dead, like in the case of the fur, or equestrian practices and selective breeding. Think about pure breeds in horses and dogs. We assume these practices might be good for the animals, but ultimately they're only really good for us. We know that selective breeding eventually impoverishes the DNA of the animal, leading to diseases and other undesired circumstances. So the surfaces that we see in this piece and the fur, which can actually be understood as a form of taxidermy, speaks of manipulation, human consumption, and the lack of differentiation which usually exists between animals and objects in our world. Very interestingly, when we look closely at It's Hard to Make a Stand, we focus on the subject of the title itself. The stand upon which the horse rests is again another play of surfaces. You can see here that the top layer is constituted by a mirror that looks golden, and part of the stand itself is actually left bare, in keeping with the postmodernist theories which very much shaped the relational with surfaces over the past 20 years, this idea of not pretending and not concealing. Yet again, there is something interesting about the surface of the reflecting mirror. It doubles up surfaces, and in that doubling up, it shows us the underbelly of the animal itself, the vulnerable part that we've of course abused over centuries and centuries of commoditization of animals. So all the surfaces that we see here speak of commoditization because of the labor that went into them and because of the way they're juxtaposed into this iconographical solution. Now, the last question that I want to attempt to answer, of course, with regards to taxidermy in contemporary art is where does it come from and why right now, why are we witnessing so much taxidermy in contemporary art? And of course, we know that the animal studies answer to that would be grounded in an idea that we are at a moment of crisis and that animals come back to ask where did our relationship go wrong with them. So the idea of the postmodern animal once again being a challenging entity, one that we cannot ignore any longer and one that demands our attention forcefully, definitely still applies here. But I believe that there is something more at play, because the artists I've been looking at, Berlinda de Bruckier and Steve Bishop, amongst many others, do not operate within the parameters of animal studies. Their work is not informed by these ideas, and therefore I'm left to wonder why this resurgence right now, why this emergence of the taxidermy surface in the gallery space. And I believe there might be two reasons why this is the case. The first might still be related to the idea of crisis and the idea that the current alienation we're experiencing with nature, the current distancing from animals and nature more in general, which is characterizing the Anthropocene right now, and of course the crisis that underrides humanity and nature at present, might be pushing artists to confront these themes in one way or another. So yes, these are works of art that emerge from an ongoing crisis, one between us and animals, and one between us and the environment and all the networks that the environment involves. But at the same time, I believe that there is something specific about the value of surfaces in art and the importance that surfaces have always played in art. I'm thinking more specifically about the internet and virtual reality, the dematerialization of objects and parts of our everyday lives that are delegated to communication via the internet. And I'm very much inclined to assume that the animal surface within this context becomes this almost violently real entity that speaks directly and shakes the viewer to rethink materiality and presence in a world where everything seems to become more immaterial and less present. Thank you very much.